In the spring of 1994, every hydraulic cylinder that came off a tractor in Tama County, Iowa, went one of three places. It went to the dealer, where they told you the part was discontinued and handed you a quote for a new assembly that cost more than your first truck. It went to the scrap pile behind the machine shed, where it sat in the mud and rusted until you forgot what it had come from. Or it went to Emmett Bakker's yard. Emmett didn't ask for this arrangement. Nobody voted on it. Nobody shook hands over it. It just happened the way things happen in small counties. Gradually, then completely, the way a field tile fails or a marriage goes quiet. One neighbor dropped off a cylinder from a 1971 John Deere 402 loader that had seized solid over the winter, said he'd pick it up when Emmett got around to it, and never came back for it. Another left two off a Farmall 5.6. That had blown their seals on the same afternoon in August, which Emmett always said was suspicious, like they'd planned it. A third left a whole milk crate of miscellaneous cylinders from 3 different decades, none of them labeled, with a note that said, "Whenever you get a chance," and a phone number that turned out to be disconnected. By 1998, Emmett had 47 hydraulic cylinders in various states of disrepair stacked along the north fence of his property on County Road E18. By 2001, he had 112. By 2004, the number had passed 200, and his neighbor Chet Sorensen, who farmed the ground to the west, told his wife at supper that Emmett Bakker had finally gone around the bend, that the old man was collecting junk the way some people collected regrets, quietly, without explanation, and in quantities that suggested a problem. Let me tell you about Emmett Bakker, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did, and you need to understand what he did before you can understand why. In the fall of 2024, there were farmers driving 3 hours to a gravel driveway in Tama County, Iowa, with hydraulic cylinders in their truck beds and something close to desperation in their eyes. Emmett was 61 years old in 1994, which meant he had been farming since before most of the men who laughed at his fence line had been born. He'd grown up on the same 320 acres his grandfather had broken from prairie sod in 1911, and he had watched 3 generations of equipment come and go across that ground. The horse-drawn stuff his grandfather had used, the early gas tractors his father had cursed through the 1950s, the hydraulic heavy machinery of his own era that could do, in an afternoon, what a man and team had once needed a week to accomplish. He had a 7th grade education and a mind that worked like a micrometer, precise and patient and calibrated to tolerances most people couldn't perceive. He had never in his life paid full price for a hydraulic cylinder because he had never in his life needed to. What Emmett understood, and what almost nobody else in Tama County had bothered to learn, was that a hydraulic cylinder is not a complicated thing. It is a tube with a rod inside it, a piston on one end of the rod and 2 seals keeping hydraulic fluid from going where it isn't supposed to go. That's essentially the whole machine. The tube can be honed if it's scratched. The rod can be re-chromed if it's pitted. The piston can be replaced if it's worn. And the seals. The seals are just rubber and polyurethane, and they fail not because they are fragile, but because they are the only part of the cylinder that was ever designed to wear out, the sacrificial component, the planned obsolescence built into a machine that was otherwise built to last a century. Emmett had learned this from his father, who had learned it from a machinist at a hydraulic repair shop in Waterloo that had closed in 1962. The knowledge had passed from hand to hand like a tool nobody wanted to put down, and Emmett had carried it for 40 years without ever thinking it was remarkable, the way you don't think it's remarkable to know how to read or how to back a trailer. It was just something he knew. It was just something he did. The cylinders piled up along his fence because word gets around in small counties. If you had a cylinder that the dealer said was discontinued, you took it to Emmett. If you had a cylinder that a shop in Cedar Rapids quoted you $400 to rebuild, you took it to Emmett. He charged what the parts cost him plus $20 for his labor, which in 1994 meant most jobs ran between $35 and $70, and he never turned a cylinder away on the grounds that it was too old or too far gone. He had rebuilt cylinders from equipment manufactured in the 1940s. He had rebuilt cylinders so corroded they looked like they'd been pulled from a shipwreck. He had rebuilt a cylinder from a 1958 New Holland baler that the owner had written off as irreparable, and he had done it in an afternoon, and he had charged the man $40, and the man had stood in Emmett's shop doorway afterward, looking at the reassembled cylinder like it was something that had come back from the dead. Let me tell you about the shop, because the shop is part of the story. It was a poured concrete building his father had put up in 1947, 40 feet by 60 feet, with a ceiling high enough to stand a loader tractor upright if you needed to, which Emmett occasionally did. The floor had been swept clean so many times over so many decades that the concrete had taken on a kind of polish in the center where the work happened, and it was stained in patterns that told the history of everything that had ever been repaired there. Oil dark in the corners, hydraulic fluid in a long streak near the lathe, grease in a semicircle around the workbench where a man's boots would stand while he leaned into a job. The lathe was a 1951 South Bend, 13 inches of swing, bought used from a machine shop in Marshalltown when Emmett was 19 years old, and still being used every week 50 years later. The honing machine was older than that. The seal press had been fabricated by Emmett's father from scrap steel and a hydraulic jack, and it worked as well as anything you could buy from a catalog. Along the south wall, on shelves his father had built from 2x6s and pipe fittings, Emmett kept his seal inventory. This is important. This is where the story turns. Starting in the early 1990s, Emmett had noticed something that nobody else seemed to be tracking. The domestic manufacturers who had once supplied hydraulic seals, the Parker-Hannifin distributors, the small regional suppliers, the machine shops that stocked seal kits for the equipment that had been made in their county, were consolidating, closing, or shifting their inventory toward newer equipment. The old seal sizes, the ones that fit cylinders from the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s, were getting harder to find. Not impossible, just harder. The lead times were stretching from days to weeks. The minimum order quantities were going up, and a new source was coming in to fill the gap. Chinese manufactured seals, imported through distributors in Chicago and Minneapolis, priced at a fraction of what the domestic suppliers had charged. Emmett bought the Chinese seals. He wasn't a man who refused progress on principle. He tested them against the domestic seals he had left in stock, and he found that for most applications they were adequate, and for some applications they were fine, and for a few applications, the high-pressure cylinders on loader tractors and large tillage equipment, they failed earlier than the domestic seals had, but not so early that most customers noticed or complained. He made a note of this in a composition notebook he kept in the top drawer of his workbench. He kept buying the imported seals because they were available and the domestic ones increasingly were not. but he also kept buying the domestic seals whenever he could find them. He bought out the remaining inventory of 2 regional distributors that went out of business in 1996 and 1998. He bought a pallet of old stock Parker seals from a machine shop in Dubuque that was converting to a different product line. He bought seal kits from estate sales and farm auctions, from retired mechanics who were cleaning out their shops, from a hydraulic repair operation in Davenport that had closed after the owner had a stroke. He stored them in glass jars labeled with the bore diameter, rod diameter, and working pressure in his own cramped handwriting, and he arranged them on the shelves by size, and he kept a running inventory in the composition notebook, and by 2005 he had somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,000 individual seal components, representing hundreds of different sizes and specifications, the majority of them domestic manufactured, a significant portion of them no longer available anywhere in the continental United States at any price. His son, Darren, who had gone to Iowa State for agricultural business and come back to help run the farm, looked at those shelves one afternoon in 2006 and said, "Dad, do you have any idea what all this is worth?" And Emmett said he had a pretty good idea. And Darren said, "Then why don't you sell it?" And Emmett said, "Because I'm going to need it." Darren thought his father was being sentimental about old parts the way old men get sentimental about old things, the way the past becomes precious in proportion to how far away it gets. He didn't argue. He'd learned by then that arguing with his father about the shop was like arguing with the weather. You could have opinions about it all you wanted, but the weather didn't care, and neither did Emmett. Now, let me tell you about the man who laughed, because every story like this has one, and in Tama County in 2006, that man was Rick Thornton. Rick Thornton was 44 years old, which made him 17 years younger than Emmett, and he had built a hydraulic and equipment service business in Toledo, the county seat, that had grown from a 1-bay shop in 1995 to a 6-bay facility with 4 full-time technicians, a parts counter, and a service truck that he drove himself to farm calls because he liked the visibility. He had a John Deere service agreement, and a Case YH service agreement, and a New Holland service agreement, and he had a wall in his office where he kept the plaques and certificates that proved it. He had a polo shirt with his company logo embroidered on the chest, and he drove a truck that was 2 years old and clean, and he had opinions about how hydraulic repair should be done in the 21st century that he shared freely at the co-op in Toledo, and at the extension service meetings in Traer, and at the Farm Bureau dinners in Dysart. His opinion about Emmett Bakker's operation was that it was a relic, a curiosity, the kind of thing that persisted in rural counties not because it was better than the alternative, but because old men with old habits were hard to redirect. He had said this, more or less in those words, at a Farm Bureau dinner in the fall of 2006, when someone had mentioned that Emmett had rebuilt a cylinder for a neighbor that Thornton's shop had quoted at $600, and Emmett had done for $55. Thornton had smiled the smile of a man who is confident enough in his position that he doesn't need to be unkind about it, and he had said that Emmett was welcome to the old iron, that his shop was focused on equipment built in the last 20 years, and that there was a reason the industry had moved toward replacement assemblies rather than rebuilds, quality control, warranty liability, and the simple economics of technician time. Then he had added, almost as an afterthought, that Emmett's seal inventory was probably half Chinese imports by now anyway, which got a laugh from the table. Emmett wasn't at the dinner. He heard about the comment second-hand from Chet Sorensen, who had been there and who relayed it with the careful neutrality of a man delivering news he knows is going to land hard. Emmett listened to the whole account without changing his expression. Then he said, "He's not entirely wrong about the imports," which was not the response Chet had expected, and went back to the cylinder he was honing. "Let me tell you about what happened between 2006 and 2024, because 18 years is a long time, and the story doesn't wait." Emmett kept working. He turned 73 in 2006, then 75, then 80. Darren took over most of the farming operation, and Emmett's days got quieter, but the shop stayed open. The cylinders kept coming. He rebuilt them at the same pace he always had, maybe a little slower in the winter when his hands stiffened up, but he never turned one away. He raised his labor rate once to $40 and then never raised it again. He kept buying seal stock when he found it, though the domestic sources had dried up almost completely by 2010. He kept the Chinese seals as his working inventory and the domestic stock on the shelves behind glass, labeled and cataloged, untouched. Rick Thornton's business grew. He added a 7th bay in 2009 and an 8th in 2014. He hired 2 more technicians and a service coordinator. He got a Kubota service agreement and a AGCO service agreement. He bought a 2nd service truck. He gave the valedictorian scholarship at the Tama County High School 2 years running, and his name was on a bench at the county fairgrounds. He had become, by any reasonable measure, the hydraulic and equipment service authority in Tama County and the counties around it. The imported cylinder assemblies and seal kits that had been flowing into the American agricultural market since the 1990s had become, by 2015, the overwhelmingly dominant supply. The domestic manufacturers who had survived into the 2000s had either been acquired by larger companies that sourced overseas or had shifted their domestic production to specialized high-end applications, aerospace, defense, heavy industrial, and had largely exited the agricultural market. For a standard agricultural hydraulic cylinder, a standard seal kit, the supply chain ran through Chinese factories, through distribution centers in coastal cities, through regional distributors, and finally to dealers and shops like Thornton's. The price was low, the availability was reliable, the quality was adequate. Nobody worried about it. Nobody except Emmett, who had been worrying about it quietly for 15 years, and who had been filling glass jars and labeling them in his cramped handwriting and arranging them on shelves in a concrete building on County Road E18, and who had never explained to anyone's satisfaction why he was doing it. Let me tell you about the spring of 2024, because that is when the story that had been building for 30 years finally arrived at the moment it had been building toward. In February of 2024, the federal government announced a significant expansion of tariffs on Chinese manufactured goods, with agricultural equipment components, including hydraulic seals, cylinder assemblies, and related parts, among the categories facing the steepest increases. The tariff rates on certain seal categories went from 7.5% to 145% overnight. The distributors who had been supplying shops like Thornton's with imported seal kits absorbed the initial shock, drew down their existing inventory, and told their customers that pricing and availability would stabilize in 4 to 6 weeks. They did not stabilize in 4 to 6 weeks. What happened instead was a cascade that anyone who had been paying attention to supply chain fragility could have predicted, and almost nobody had. The Chinese manufacturers, facing the tariff wall, reduced their export volume to the American market. The American distributors, caught between suppliers cutting shipments and customers needing parts, found their inventory depleted faster than it could be replenished. The domestic manufacturing capacity that might have filled the gap had been dismantled over 2 decades of offshoring. The tooling was gone, the workforce was gone, the supply chains for domestic raw materials had atrophied. Rebuilding domestic seal manufacturing capacity was a project measured in years, not weeks. By April of 2024, Rick Thornton's parts counter had a waiting list for seal kits. By May, the waiting list was 6 weeks long. By June, it was 12 weeks, and the price of the kits that were available had tripled from their pre-tariff levels. Farmers whose hydraulic cylinders had failed in the spring planting season were facing a choice between waiting 3 months for a rebuild kit, paying premium prices for whatever inventory could be found through secondary suppliers, or leaving equipment parked in the field. Thornton got on the phone with his distributors every morning. He drove to Des Moines twice in May to meet with regional parts managers. He found a supplier in Canada who had domestic manufactured seal stock and placed an order that cost him 4 times what he would have paid 6 months earlier. He passed the cost to his customers, which he had no choice about, and his customers paid it, which they had no choice about either, and everyone was unhappy, and the equipment still sat waiting. Let me tell you about the Tuesday morning in June of 2024 when Chet Sorensen's son, a man named Paul who had taken over his father's farm after Chet passed in 2019, drove down County Road E18 and turned into Emmett Bakker's driveway with a blown cylinder from his 2003 case WAN HMX 240 in the bed of his truck. Paul Sorensen was 38 years old and had never had a conversation with Emmett Bakker about hydraulic seals. He had been taking his equipment to Thornton's for his entire adult life. He had called Thornton's that morning and been told the wait for a seal kit for his cylinder was 9 weeks, minimum, and the price would be somewhere between $400 and $600 depending on what came in. His MX 240 was his primary tillage tractor. He needed it running in 2 weeks for summer field work. He had heard from someone, he couldn't remember who, maybe at the elevator, maybe at the fuel stop, that the old man at the end of County Road E18 sometimes had parts that nobody else had. He hadn't known what to expect. What he found was a 71-year-old man in canvas work pants and a flannel shirt standing in a shop doorway, looking at the cylinder in Paul's truck bed with the calm assessment of a doctor looking at an X-ray. Emmett looked at the cylinder for about 30 seconds. Then he said, "Bring it in." Paul carried it into the shop, and Emmett put it on the workbench and disassembled it in about 12 minutes, working with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has done a thing so many times that the motion has become entirely automatic. He looked at the bore. He looked at the rod. He looked at the failed seals, which had hardened and cracked in the way that seals do when the hydraulic fluid has overheated or been contaminated. He went to the shelves on the south wall and came back with a glass jar and set it on the bench next to the cylinder. "I can do this today," he said. $60. Paul Sorensen stood in that shop for a moment with the particular expression of a man recalibrating everything he thought he knew about a situation. He said, "Thornton's quoted me $400 to $600 and a 9-week wait." Emmett said, "I know what Thornton's is quoting." The cylinder was ready in 4 hours. Paul picked it up that afternoon, paid $60 in cash, and drove home. He had the tractor running the next morning. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. How many hydraulic cylinders do you think failed in Tama County between April and September of 2024? How many tractors sat waiting for seal kits that were on back order? How many farmers called Thornton's that spring and summer and heard 9 weeks, 12 weeks? We'll call you when it comes in. The answer, as best as anyone has been able to reconstruct it, is somewhere north of 300 individual cylinder failures across the county that season, representing equipment that collectively could not wait for the supply chain to sort itself out. Word travels fast in a county of 6,000 people when someone has what everyone needs. By the end of June, Emmett had a line of trucks on County Road E18 on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, which were the days he had designated for drop-offs after the volume got to be more than he could manage on an ad hoc basis. Farmers he had never met drove from Benton County and Marshall County and Poweshiek County with cylinders in their truck beds. A man from Hardin County drove 2 hours and brought 11 cylinders from 3 different pieces of equipment and stood in Emmett's shop looking at the shelves with an expression that combined relief and something close to reverence. Emmett rebuilt them all. He worked at the same pace he always had. He charged $60 in labor across the board, regardless of the cylinder size, with parts at cost on top. He turned nobody away. Let me tell you about what was happening at Thornton's during those same weeks, because this is the part of the story that requires some fairness. Rick Thornton was not a bad man, and he was not a stupid man. He was a man who had built a business on the supply chain that existed, and when that supply chain failed, he was as trapped by it as anyone. He had done everything right by the standards of his industry. He had the service agreements and the trained technicians and the modern diagnostic equipment. He had the relationships with the distributors. He had the business model that made sense when parts were available and affordable. None of that helped him when the parts weren't available and the prices had tripled. He heard about Emmett's operation from a customer in late June, not for the first time, but for the first time in a context that made him take it seriously. The customer was a man named Darrell Huber, who farmed 600 acres east of Toledo and who had been a Thornton's customer for 15 years. Huber had brought a cylinder to Emmett, gotten it back in a day for $60, and had mentioned this to Thornton not to rub it in, but because he genuinely thought Thornton might want to know. Thornton had nodded and said something professionally neutral and gone back to his office and sat for a while with his door closed. He knew about Emmett's seal inventory. He had known about it for years in the abstract way you know about things that don't seem relevant to your situation. He had made the comment at the Farm Bureau dinner in 2006, the one about Chinese imports, and he was not proud of it now. He had been wrong about the imports, or rather, he had been right in the short term and catastrophically wrong in the long term, and Emmett had been right in the long term and had been sitting on that rightness for 18 years without saying a word about it to anyone. Thornton drove out to County Road E18 on a Wednesday morning in July. He had thought about calling first and decided against it. He pulled into the driveway and parked behind a truck from Marshall County whose owner was apparently inside. He waited. When the Marshall County truck left, he got out and walked to the shop. Emmett was at the workbench. He looked up when Thornton came in and said nothing, which was a form of greeting in its own right. Thornton looked at the shelves. He looked at the glass jars with their handwritten labels. He looked at the lathe and the honing machine and the seal press that Emmett's father had built from scrap steel. He stood there for a moment with his hands in his pockets, and then he said, "How long have you had all this?" Emmett said, "The domestic stock? Most of it since the late 90s, some of it longer." Thornton said, "How did you know?" Emmett picked up the cylinder he had been working on and turned it slowly in his hands, looking at the bore in the light from the window. He said, "I didn't know. I just paid attention to what was disappearing and bought it before it was gone." He set the cylinder back down. You can do that with most things if you're watching. Thornton was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've got customers who've been waiting since April. I've got a farmer in Traer whose planter hydraulics are down, and he's looking at missing his whole second cutting window. I've got—" He stopped. He looked at the shelves again. "I don't suppose you'd be willing to work something out." Emmett looked at him for the first time with something that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. He said, "I've been rebuilding cylinders for your customers since June. What do you think I've been doing?" Thornton said, "I meant something more formal. A supply arrangement. I could send work your way, handle the customer intake, you do the rebuild." Emmett said, "I'm already doing the rebuilds. I don't need you to send work my way. They're finding me." This was true, and Thornton knew it was true, and the knowing of it was a particular kind of difficult. He said, "I made a comment about your operation years ago at a Farm Bureau dinner." Emmett said, "I heard about it." Thornton said, "I was wrong." Emmett said, "About which part?" Thornton said, "About most of it." Emmett nodded once, the way a man nods when he receives information he already had. He said, "The Chinese seals aren't all bad. For standard pressure applications on newer equipment, they're fine. The problem was never the seals. The problem was having only one source for anything. You can't run a farm on a single point of failure. You can't run a county on one either." He picked up a glass jar from the shelf and turned it in his hands, the small rubber seals shifting inside it. "My father told me that. He was talking about seed varieties, but it applies." Thornton looked at the jar. He said, "I've got a farmer in Dysart with a cylinder I can't get parts for. 1998 case, 3-point hitch cylinder. The bore size is—" and he gave the dimensions. Emmett went to the shelf without hesitating and came back with 2 jars. He said, "I've got the seals. Bring the cylinder Thursday." Let me tell you about the fall of 2024, because the harvest season is when the full weight of what Emmett had been building for 30 years became impossible to ignore. The tariff situation did not resolve by fall. The supply chain did not stabilize. The distributors, who had promised 4 to 6 weeks in April, were now talking about Q1 of 2025 for certain seal categories. The farmers, who had managed to limp through spring planting with workarounds and borrowed equipment, were now facing harvest with hydraulic systems that had been running on borrowed time all summer. Combine headers, grain cart cylinders, auger systems, unloading mechanisms. The harvest season puts hydraulic systems under sustained high-pressure load for weeks at a time, and systems that had been marginal in the spring were failing in October. Emmett rebuilt 114 cylinders between September and November of 2024. Darren, who had been watching the operation scale up all summer with a mixture of pride and logistical concern, helped with the intake and the customer communication. He kept a spreadsheet of the jobs, the parts used, the customers, the counties they came from. By November, customers had come from 11 counties. The furthest had driven from Winnebago County, near the Minnesota border, 4 hours each way, because someone at a co-op had told them that the old man in Tama County had domestic seal stock and could turn a cylinder in a day. The composition notebook in the top drawer of Emmett's workbench had been joined by 3 more, all of them filled with the same cramped handwriting, the same catalog of sizes and specifications, and the inventory counts that were now, after 30 years of accumulation, and a single extraordinary season of drawdown beginning to show the first signs of depletion. Emmett had started rationing certain seal sizes in October, keeping back enough stock for the equipment he knew was in his own county before filling orders from further away. He had started a waiting list of his own, which was a thing he had never needed before. Darren sat with him at the kitchen table one evening in November and showed him the spreadsheet. He showed him the revenue numbers, which were modest by any commercial standard, but which represented something like 4 times what the shop had earned in any previous year. He showed him the geographic spread of the customers. He showed him the inventory projections, which suggested that at the current rate of drawdown, certain critical seal sizes would be exhausted within 18 months. Emmett looked at the spreadsheet for a long time. He said, "We need to find more domestic stock." Darren said, "Dad, I don't think there is more domestic stock, not in any quantity." Emmett said, "There's always more. You just have to know where to look." He thought for a moment. "There's a retired machinist in Grundy Center who was buying Parker stock out of a closed distributor around 2008. I don't know if he still has it. There's an estate in Buchanan County. The man died in 2021. His son told me he'd cleaned out the shop, but I don't think he knew what he had. And there's a hydraulic shop in Waterloo that went to cylinder replacement only about 15 years ago. They might have kept their rebuild inventory." Darren wrote these down. He found the Grundy Center machinist through a phone call to the local implement dealer, and the machinist did still have the stock. 3 large plastic bins of Parker seal kits, still in their original packaging, that he had been keeping in his garage for no reason he could articulate, except that it seemed wrong to throw them away. He sold them to Emmett for $200, which was approximately 1/40th of what they would have cost to replace on the open market in the fall of 2024. The Buchanan County estate yielded nothing useful. The Waterloo shop had kept its rebuild inventory in a back room and had forgotten it was there, and when Darren called, the owner went and looked and came back to the phone sounding slightly stunned, and they drove to Waterloo that Saturday and came home with enough seal stock to extend Emmett's inventory by another 2 years. Now, let me tell you about the evening in December of 2024, when Rick Thornton came back to the shop on County Road E18, because the first visit had been about asking for help, and the second visit was about something different. He came in the early evening, after the shop had closed for the day, and he knocked on the door of the house instead of the shop, which was a different kind of visit. Emmett answered and let him in, and they sat at the kitchen table, and Darren made coffee, and Thornton had brought a bottle of bourbon that he set on the table without comment, which Emmett accepted without comment, and Darren found 3 glasses. Thornton said, "I want to tell you something, and I want to say it straight." He looked at the table. "I've been in this business for 30 years. I've got 8 bays and 6 technicians and service agreements with 4 manufacturers. And this fall, the thing that kept more equipment running in this county than anything I did was a concrete building on a gravel road and a collection of parts that everyone, including me, thought was a junk pile." He picked up his glass. "I don't know how you knew. I don't know if you knew, or if you just did what you always did, and it happened to be the right thing. But I want to say that I was wrong about your operation, and I was wrong about what this county needed, and I should have been paying better attention." Emmett was quiet for a moment. He said, "You weren't wrong that the industry moved toward replacement assemblies. That was the economics of it, and you followed the economics. That's a reasonable thing to do." He turned his glass in his hands. The problem with following economics is that economics doesn't account for what happens when the supply disappears. It only accounts for what's there right now. Thornton said, "How do you account for it?" Emmett said, "You watch what's disappearing. You ask yourself why it's disappearing, and then you decide whether you want to be the person who still has it when everyone else needs it." He set down his glass. "My father kept seed from every variety he ever grew, even after the commercial varieties came in and everyone said the old ones were obsolete. He kept them in paper envelopes in a tin box in the cellar. I used to think it was sentiment. It wasn't sentiment. It was insurance." Thornton said, "The tariff situation may ease. The supply chains may normalize." Emmett said, "They may, and if they do, you'll go back to ordering from your distributor, and I'll go back to rebuilding cylinders for my neighbors at $60, and that'll be fine." He paused. But the domestic manufacturing capacity that was lost in the 90s and the 2000s isn't coming back because a tariff eased. That takes decades, and there'll be another disruption. There's always another disruption. The question is whether you have anything in reserve when it comes. Thornton stayed for 2 hours. When he left, he shook Emmett's hand at the door, and Emmett said, "Bring me the Dysart Farmer's cylinder, the one with the 3-point hitch. I've been holding the seals for it." Thornton said, "I thought you already did that one." Emmett said, "I did the one from July. He's got a second one that went in October. He called me last week." Thornton shook his head slowly. He said, "How many cylinders have you got on your list right now?" Emmett said, 43. I'll work through them by February." Thornton drove home on County Road E18 in the December dark, and the gravel road stretched out in his headlights, and the Bakker place receded in his mirror. The concrete shop, the fence line where the cylinders had piled up for 30 years, the light in the kitchen window. He had driven this road 1,000 times. He had never really looked at it. Let me tell you about what happened in the spring of 2025 because the story doesn't end in December. The tariff situation did not ease in the first quarter of 2025. It deepened. Additional categories of hydraulic components were added to the affected list, and the distributors who had been projecting normalization pushed their timelines back again, and the farmers who had been waiting since the previous spring found themselves waiting still. The domestic manufacturing sector that had been talking about rebuilding capacity announced timelines of 18 to 36 months for meaningful production. The gap between what the agricultural market needed and what the supply chain could deliver was, by the spring of 2025, wider than it had been at any point in the previous year. Emmett's shop on County Road E18 had, by this point, become something that had no good name in the language of agricultural economics. It was not a dealer. It was not a distributor. It was not a repair shop in the conventional sense. It was a man with a lathe and a honing machine and 4,000 glass jars of seal components that he had spent 30 years collecting because he had been paying attention when everyone else had been following the economics. And it was, in the spring of 2025, one of the most important pieces of agricultural infrastructure in a 6-county area of central Iowa. Darren had built a simple website over the winter, at the insistence of customers who wanted to know what seal sizes Emmett had in stock before driving 3 hours. The website had a contact form and an inventory list that Darren updated every 2 weeks from the composition notebooks. It had no photos and no branding and no language about mission or values. It had Emmett's name and the address on County Road E18 and a list of seal specifications. Within 6 weeks of going live, it had been shared in 17 different online farming communities and generated inquiries from 8 states. Emmett did not read the website. He did not have a computer. He did not know about the farming communities where his name was being shared. He knew about the trucks in his driveway on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and he knew about the cylinders on his workbench, and he knew about the glass jars on the shelves, and he knew that the inventory he had spent 30 years building was doing exactly what he had always understood it would do someday, which was keep equipment running when nothing else could. He was 81 years old in the spring of 2025. His hands were slower than they had been. He worked mornings and stopped at noon and let Darren handle the afternoon intake. He had started teaching Darren the rebuild process in earnest. Not the basics which Darren had absorbed by proximity over decades, but the fine work, the measurement and the judgment, the reading of wear patterns in a bore, the assessment of a rod's surface condition, the selection of seal material for a specific application and pressure range. He taught the way his father had taught him, by doing the work and talking through it, not by explaining in the abstract. One Tuesday morning in March of 2025, a young woman came to the shop. She was maybe 25 years old, and she had driven from Ames, and she had a cylinder from a research station implement in her truck, and she was a graduate student in agricultural engineering at Iowa State. She had found the website. She had a notebook, not a composition notebook, but a spiral-bound engineering notebook, and she had questions that were more technical than Emmett usually got from farmers. Questions about seal material selection and pressure ratings and the degradation mechanisms of different polyurethane formulations. Emmett answered her questions for 2 hours. He showed her the seal press his father had built. He showed her the composition notebooks with 30 years of inventory records. He showed her the honing machine and explained the surface finish specifications that determined whether a bore could be saved or had to be replaced. She took notes in the engineering notebook, filling pages in a small, careful hand. When she left, she shook Emmett's hand and said, "I'm writing my thesis on domestic hydraulic component supply chain resilience. Can I come back?" Emmett said, "Come on a Tuesday or Thursday." She came back 4 more times before the end of the semester. On her last visit, she brought her thesis advisor, a professor from the agricultural engineering department who had been studying supply chain vulnerabilities in the Midwest farming sector for 15 years. And who stood in Emmett's shop with the expression of a man who has spent years building a theoretical framework and has just walked into a perfect empirical case study. He asked Emmett if he would be willing to be interviewed for a research paper. Emmett said he'd think about it. He thought about it for a week and then said yes, on the condition that they didn't use the address in anything published because he didn't want more trucks than he could handle. The professor agreed. The paper was submitted to a journal in the fall of 2025. Its central argument was that the 30-year accumulation of domestic hydraulic seal inventory by a single operator in Tama County, Iowa, represented